Santa late because he can't find our ranch? Asked a little girl to the lone cowboy on the road. Hollow Ridge Ranch, Wyoming Territory. A few days before Christmas, late 19th century. The sky hung low and pale over the hills, with clouds like wet wool and air sharp enough to split firewood. Hollow Ridge Ranch lay deep in a forgotten valley, a speck of life surrounded by brittle grass and stubborn snow. The barn's roof leaned to one side, the fence rattled. Smoke barely rose from the chimney, as if the fire inside struggled to stay alive. May stood by the fence in silence. 4 years old, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big, her knitted cap slipping sideways. Her small boots sank into the snow, but she did not notice. Her eyes were locked on the winding dirt road that faded into the horizon. Nothing had passed that way in hours. She leaned forward on the top rail, clutching it with mittened hands, and called out softly into the wind. "Is Santa late because he can't find our ranch?" There was no answer, only the creaking of dry wood. But her voice hung in the cold, a question too large for someone her size. Inside the yard, Ruth was wrestling with a warped sheet of tin, trying to nail it back over a gap in the barn roof. Her fingers were red, her breath shallow, and each strike of the hammer echoed like a sigh. She paused when she heard May's voice, looked over, and saw the small figure by the fence. Ruth forced a smile, though her heart tightened. There was no tree in the house, no wrapped box hidden under the bed, no sweet to sneak into her daughter's stocking, if she could have found one. She did not know how to answer a question like that. May turned her head and looked at her mother. "Maybe Santa's map is too old," she said, half to herself. "Maybe our roof doesn't shine like the big houses." Ruth walked over, crouched beside her, and tucked May's scarf higher up her chin. "Maybe he just needs a better guide," Ruth said gently. May nodded, serious, and returned her gaze to the road. A few minutes passed. Then, from beyond the hill, hoofbeats. Soft at first, then clearer. May stood taller. A white horse appeared, its breath steaming, its rider wrapped in a dark coat. He moved slow, like the cold did not bother him, like he had been riding a long time and still had farther to go. May's eyes widened. She raised a hand, waved once, and called out, "Mister, did you see Santa on the road?" The rider slowed. "Is Santa late because he can't find our ranch?" He pulled the reins gently. The horse stopped beside the fence. The cowboy looked at her. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, wind-burned and quiet. He did not speak for a few seconds. Then the corners of his mouth lifted, just a little. He touched the brim of his hat, nodded once, and said nothing. But in his eyes there was something that softened, and May, watching him, smiled. Inside the cabin, the wind pressed against the walls like a silent question. Ruth stood by the rough kitchen counter, tilting a tin can over the wooden bowl. Only a few coarse grains of cornmeal trickled out. Not enough for a loaf, maybe enough for one more flat cake, if she stretched it with water and hope. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked around the tiny room. One candle stub left, no ribbon, no sweet. The silence of the house felt heavier than the cold. Behind her, the door creaked. May rushed in, cheeks pink from the wind. "Mama," she said, breathless, "if Santa's map is old, maybe he doesn't see our roof." Ruth turned, bent to her daughter's height, and brushed snowflakes from her cap. She smiled softly. "Maybe he just needs a better light to guide him," she said. May nodded, then slipped out again, full of thought. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the hills turned blue with shadow, hooves crunched on frost, Ruth stepped outside. Down the path, the same white horse appeared, moving slowly through the dusk. Luke, though neither mother nor daughter yet knew his name, sat straight in the saddle, reins loose in his gloved hands. He stopped at the broken fence, did not call out. May was first to see him. She skipped to the gate and lifted her voice. "Mister, if you see Santa, tell him we're not too small, okay?" Luke's eyes flicked from the girl to the sagging ranch house, to the twisted metal on the roof. He didn't answer. Instead, he dismounted, walking slowly toward the broken fence post nearby. He crouched, inspected the splintered wood, and reached for the tools hanging from his saddle. Ruth stepped outside, brow furrowed. "You don't have to do that," she said, voice careful. Luke kept his eyes on the post. "It was falling anyway," he replied quietly. He worked without asking, hands practiced, movements clean. When he finished, he stood, brushing dust from his coat. He walked back to his horse, opened a saddlebag, and pulled out a small bundle of dry pine branches. He handed them to May. "Put these by the window," he said. "They catch light. Maybe Santa will notice." May cradled the bundle like a treasure. Her face lit up. "Thank you," she beamed. Luke nodded once, mounted, and without another word, rode off into the growing dark. Ruth stood beside her daughter, watching his figure disappear over the ridge. May leaned into her side, holding the pine close. "He came back," May whispered. Ruth didn't answer. But something in her chest stirred, for the first time in a long while, not from fear, but from the faintest spark of warmth. Under the brittle sky, Dusty Hollow stirred with the uneasy cheer of a frontier Christmas. The town's lone street bustled with quiet urgency. The blacksmith's forge hissed through the cold, a general store displayed faded ribbons, and a lopsided wreath hung on the saloon door, its pine needles already browning. Snow clung to corners, melting just enough to make the boardwalk slick. Ruth led May carefully along it, one hand holding a coin purse too light for comfort. May clutched a bundle of dry pine branches in her mittened arms, given to her days ago by a quiet cowboy with kind eyes. Her gaze flicked to every window they passed, where candles burned low and wreaths circled with red cloth hung bright against the frost. She didn't ask for anything. She just watched, eyes wide with silent hope. Inside the general store, Ruth sorted coins on the counter, enough for a sack of flour, a stub of candle, and a few sticks of firewood. The storekeeper leaned across his display, casting a look at May and her bundle. "She yours?" he asked, voice gruff. Ruth nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, sir." The man grunted, then turned toward another customer and muttered, loud enough for May to hear, "Some places are too poor for Santa to waste time on." The other man chuckled. "Santa don't drop down chimneys made of rust." May blinked slowly. Her grip on the pine bundle tightened. As they stepped to the back of the store, a woman behind the counter, noticing the bundle in May's arms, spoke with a smirk. "Only good children get gifts," she said. "Maybe she's hoping too much." Ruth said nothing. Her mouth thinned, and her eyes dropped. She took the flour and firewood and nudged May gently toward the door. Back outside, the wind met them like a scold. May said nothing for a few steps, then whispered, "Maybe Santa reads different rules for houses like ours." Ruth's eyes stung. She couldn't argue. She could barely speak. Across the street, a pale horse stood tethered outside the blacksmith's shop. Beside it, Luke, dusty coat, hat low, tightened a saddle strap. He'd heard everything. Two men near the horses nudged each other, eyeing Luke. "That's the Lone Cowboy," one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Came from the Silver Line Trail, never stays put." The other grinned, louder, pointing a thumb toward May. "Hey, cowboy, tell Santa to bring extra pity this year. That little girl's got more hope than kindling." Luke didn't flinch. He crossed the street slowly, his boots quiet on the snow-dusted boards. He stopped beside Ruth and held out a small cloth pouch. "Dropped these," he said. Ruth looked down. A handful of nails rested inside, still warm. She hadn't dropped anything, but she took them. Luke turned toward the loud man and said in a voice steady as stone, "Santa finds hearts, not houses. Some folks forget how to build either." Silence followed. No one responded. May stared at him, her expression unreadable, half wonder, half something older. Luke's eyes softened as he looked at her. He stepped back to his horse, reached into the saddlebag, and returned with a square of soft wool, faded and stitched at the corners. He knelt beside May and offered it to her. "Keep this in your pocket," he said. "It catches warm wishes." May took it as though it might shatter. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke nodded once, stood, and swung onto his horse. Ruth watched him ride away without a word. May stood still for a long time, the bundle of pine in one hand, the wool square clutched to her chest. In her silence, hope took root again. The wind howled low across the ridge, sweeping flakes of snow into brittle spirals. The sky hung heavy and dark, cloaking the ranch in a deep, endless quiet. Inside the small cabin, Ruth huddled near the fire, feeding it the last of their chopped wood, splinters and bits too small for real heat. The flame flickered but offered little comfort. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of the cold, of worry, of another Christmas with too little to give. She watched May from the window. The little girl wore 2 coats layered over her small frame, boots far too large, and a wool scarf wrapped twice around her chin. Her tiny hands worked with purpose. She was decorating. May had lined up white stones along the base of the fence. She had stuck small dry twigs into the snow and balanced pine branches atop them, mimicking a tree line. Bits of red thread from an old blanket tied the twigs together. "So Santa knows someone lives here," May had explained earlier, with all the seriousness a 4-year-old could carry. Ruth had smiled, weakly, then turned away to hide the sting behind her eyes. Later that night, long after May had fallen asleep, wrapped in every spare blanket, Ruth stirred from her uneasy rest. A faint flicker caught her eye through the cabin's warped window pane. She stepped to the door and opened it just enough to peer out. Luke was there. He moved quietly in the snow, unaware, or maybe unbothered, that he was being watched. His white horse stood tied near the shed, tail swishing gently. Luke climbed the fence post with ease and tied a piece of cloth high on one of the corner rails. It shimmered faintly. A soaked rag? No, it was coated in something slick, pine tar maybe. It caught the starlight, flickering like a weak lantern, a makeshift beacon. Then he turned toward the animal pen and began bracing the loose door with new nails. He added fresh straw inside the shelter, securing the roof with a few swift blows from a hammer pulled from his saddlebag. No one had asked. He just did it. Ruth watched silently. Her breath trembled against the cold, fogging the air. She did not call out. She did not stop him. Somewhere deep inside her, something softened, and something else curled tight in fear. Hope was dangerous, and hope in a stranger was worse. A few minutes later, the front door creaked. May had stirred. She wrapped herself in the patched quilt and tiptoed outside, her feet crunching softly in the snow. She climbed onto the lower rung of the fence and sat there, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes locked on the glimmering cloth swaying in the wind. Luke saw her. He adjusted the rope one last time, then walked over slowly. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. May shook her head. "It's too quiet." Luke leaned on the fence beside her. They sat in silence for a long while, just watching the faint shimmer of the cloth above them. Then May spoke, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "Maybe Santa is just scared to come here." Luke turned to look at her, surprised. "Scared?" May nodded. "Mama says even strong folks get scared of lonely places." Luke's jaw tightened. He looked out over the quiet hills, the shadows falling across the snow. Then, after a pause, he answered softly, "Santa comes where love is loudest, even if houses are small." May didn't reply, but she leaned a little closer to him. Luke reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out something small. A silver coin, worn and smooth, with a hole drilled through the top, a string of rough twine looped through it. "My mama used to hang this by the window," he said, turning it over in his fingers. "Said it reflects wishes back to the stars." He handed it to her. May's eyes lit up as she held the coin. She didn't ask if it was magic. She didn't ask why he gave it to her. She just whispered, "I'll hang it by the window, so Santa knows we're wishing real hard." Luke nodded. Then he stood, brushed the snow from his coat, and gave her a look that felt almost like a promise. She watched him ride off again. But this time, she didn't feel quite so alone. Night had fallen quiet after the storm. The wind still slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls, whistling low like a song forgotten by time. Inside the little cabin, a single blanket wrapped around mother and daughter on the small bed near the dying hearth. The fire had given all it had to give, leaving only a faint glow in the coals. May curled against Ruth, her little body cold but still warm with thoughts. "Mama?" she whispered. Ruth opened her eyes, voice low. "I dreamed something," May said. Ruth kissed the top of her daughter's head. "What did you dream?" May's voice was soft, almost like the snow still falling outside. "I saw Santa, but he was lost. There was so much snow and he couldn't see the sky." Ruth stayed still. "But then," May continued, "he met a cowboy. He was riding a white horse, and Santa asked him, 'Do you know where Hollow Ridge is?'" Ruth smiled faintly in the dark. May's breath tickled her neck, and the cowboy pointed to our ranch and said, "They are waiting." Then Santa smiled real big when he saw him. She paused, her next words barely a whisper. "In my dream, Santa smiled when he saw you." Ruth's heart cracked open, silently. She stroked May's hair and forced her voice to stay even. "Dreams are kind sometimes." May nodded once and drifted off, her tiny fingers still curled into Ruth's shirt. When she was sure her daughter was asleep, Ruth turned her face away. Her eyes stung. She bit her lip, because she was scared. Scared May was wishing for something that would never come. Scared she had nothing left to give. Outside, under a sky heavy with clouds, Luke stood splitting the last of the dry wood he had found near the barn. The rhythm of the axe was steady, the cold sharp enough to numb thought. He heard the door open behind him. Ruth stepped out, coat wrapped tightly, boots crunching on frozen earth. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said. Luke paused, glanced back. "You're not." She hesitated, then said, "May had a dream." He stopped completely. "She told me Santa was lost, but that a cowboy helped him find the way. She said Santa smiled when he saw him." Luke turned back to the woodpile. "That sounds like a good dream." Ruth looked at him, really looked, for the first time. "I think she sees more than we think," she said. Luke didn't respond. She waited, then added, "She thinks the cowboy was you." His shoulders tensed, the axe lowered to his side. "I used to have a place," he said finally. "Not so different from this one. Wooden roof, broken fence, a porch that creaked when you stepped on it." He took a breath. "My wife hung bells every Christmas. My little boy used to ask me where Santa slept during the day." Ruth didn't speak. The air grew heavier. "There was a fire," Luke said quietly. "I wasn't home." He looked up at the hills, not meeting her eyes. "After that, I never stayed long anywhere, never wanted to be anyone's reason for waiting again." Ruth's eyes softened. "But you came back." Luke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I do not stay because staying feels like promising. And I am bad at promises." Silence stretched between them, filled with the ache of things lost. Then Luke reached into his coat. He pulled out something wrapped in cloth. A small, uneven piece of ginger candy, handmade, slightly bent, but whole. Without a word, he walked past Ruth and stepped up to the cabin window. He placed the candy on the sill, right where May always stood to look outside. "She should have something sweet in her dream," he said simply. And then he turned back into the night. The next morning, sunlight touched the frost. May woke, rubbed her eyes, and wandered to the window. She saw it there. The candy. She gasped, picked it up with reverence, and held it to her chest. "Mama," she beamed. "Santa remembered early this year." Ruth knelt beside her, brushing back her hair. "Looks like he did." Outside, from a distance, Luke watched through the fence, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Snow had started falling again, soft and quiet, like feathers drifting from a torn pillow in the sky. The world outside Hollow Ridge Ranch was coated in silver hush. Inside, Ruth wiped down the rough wooden table with a cloth worn thin. She straightened the only cup they had not chipped, though it was still cracked at the rim, and placed it in the center of the table, as if it were fine china. May stood near the door, clutching a faded red stocking. She held it close, eyes flickering between the nails in the wooden beam and the stocking in her hands. She hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she whispered, "Just in case Santa comes late." She hung it gently on the bent nail beside the door. The two sat together by the window, cloaked in their shared silence. The glow of a single oil lamp cast soft golden ripples onto the frost-covered glass. Outside, the snow glistened like diamond dust, untouched. They waited. There was no sleigh bell, no silhouette in the snow, no hoofprints, just the wind, whispering past the old barn, and the ticking of Ruth's worry. Time passed slowly, painfully. May's breath fogged the window as she pressed her nose to the cold pane. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "Maybe Santa forgot us. Maybe we are not good enough." Ruth pulled her into a hug, held her tight. She wanted to say no, wanted to tell her she was wrong, but her own heart doubted, and her lips stayed still. Then came a flicker, barely visible through the glass. A faint light, moving near the fence. May gasped, her eyes wide. Through the darkness, the figure of Luke emerged, shoulders hunched slightly under the snow. He was carrying something, no, several things, strapped together. He moved to the fence line, tying up makeshift decorations, an old lantern with a cracked pane, a polished scrap of tin that caught the firelight, pieces of shaped wood he had carved crudely into a star. There was no sound, no song, just light, fragile, flickering, imperfect, but unmistakably there. Ruth rose slowly. May stayed glued to the glass, her hands pressed flat. Luke worked quickly but gently, stepping with care, as if not to wake the night. When he reached the porch, he knelt down and placed 3 small bundles beside the door. A tiny pillow, stitched with uneven hands but stuffed with soft straw. A braid of hair ribbon, twined carefully like a charm. And a worn, empty photo clip, metal faded, but still strong. He didn't knock, didn't speak. But as he turned to leave, Ruth opened the door quietly behind him. Luke paused. She didn't say, "Merry Christmas." He didn't, either.